Drinking coffee and I got a beard, so not for long if my wife gets her way. All right, so Genesis chapter 25. I'm going to try to, on Sundays, as much as possible, well, I won't necessarily stick to it all times, but try to stick with preaching from what the Bible reading plan said, for the previous week, something in that reading schedule. I'm going to try to preach from that. And I'm going to try this year also to have our guys preach more often. And so, Lord willing, Brother Allen will preach next Sunday, and then I'll preach the following Sunday, and then Brother Josh will preach that following Sunday. So we'll try to do about every other week, unless, it just kind of depends on what comes in, who wants to preach, who's ready, or, we get through certain books of the Bible, they might be like, I'm going to wait till after this. I'm just kidding. And then... So in this reading, obviously there's tons of stories. When you're in Genesis, the book of Genesis, you could preach off almost every page, and it's actually kind of fun preaching from my perspective. But I landed on this chapter here in chapter 25, and it seems kind of weird, but every time I read this chapter, I think about this, and I don't think I've ever preached or even mentioned it in a message that I preached about how Isaac and Ishmael are together at Abraham's burial. And so I was like, I just want to preach on that, and I want to, think maybe something's going to come of that, and I'll just study it, and I'll think about like burial in the Bible, and I even thought like, hey, we are having a baptism, so I can think about tie that in with burial, and no, that didn't really work. What it comes down to, and this is a strange thing for a Sunday morning, I know, but we don't do Sunday school here, and so it's been a while since we actually had any kind of this type of a study or whatever. So I feel like the Lord has changed the direction of it to a pretty practical message on, the title of the message is Burying Father Abraham, but in reality, a more practical title is just Preparing for Your Burial and the Burial of Your Loved Ones, okay? Sounds super boring, I know. But, believe it or not, the process of burying somebody is something I get questions on a lot. And it's inevitable this, though we don't want to talk about it, don't want to face it, it's going to come up in our family. We're going to have somebody that's going to die, and we're going to have these questions, and we're going to have to think about these things. And so it seems like, hey, maybe this is a great thing to talk about. And unfortunately, buried several people in Iola. Two funerals I did before I was even a pastor, as a youth pastor. Like, my link to that family was, they knew me more than they knew the pastor, so they asked me to baptize them, and the Lord used that as kind of an interesting story. But, it was pretty interesting, to just walk in, having to do that, and to see that side of things, the end of somebody's life, and say the final words, and pay, pay honor to their memory. But one thing I found out real quickly is people aren't usually prepared, because nobody really wants to think about their death, and none of us know when we're going to die, and so few people are actually prepared for that. And so particularly in our society today, where it gets kind of expensive, and there's all these laws, and there's all these different things, it can hit somebody real hard. So I thought, I don't know, maybe God will use this somehow. Maybe it's something that we need to think about. I'll try to make a little application at the end. But mostly, we're going to see that, here's my goal for this message. I want to remind us of the importance of preparing for our death, burial. Now, I'm not talking about salvation. Obviously, that's the first thing you need to prepare for. Make sure you're saved. That's the most important thing. But I want to talk about some more practical things when it comes to burying our loved ones or preparing for our own burial. And I want to share my thoughts on what is a proper burial, and most importantly, give a biblical view on burials, okay? So in this text, look at verse 7. It says, "And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life with which he lived, 163 years, so 175 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." Now, it was actually prophesied already. It was told to Abraham that he was going to live a long life. So go back to chapter 15, and we'll see this. In fact, it was an interesting thing among the Hebrew people in that time, the patriarchs particularly. They lived good, long lives. And in fact, you remember when they go into Egypt, Pharaoh is just kind of marveling at Jacob. And whenever Joseph brings Jacob, and he's like, how old are you? Like, there's this curiosity, because it was quite a privilege for someone to have a long life. And so when he sees somebody at an older age, it's a sign that they had a good life. And it was kind of like a badge of honor to say someone lived a long life, and then to be buried in such a way, to be honored as somebody who had a long life, who lived a good life and all that. Chapter 15, verse 15, he says, and thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age. And so chapter 25, that's exactly what happens. Now, we see also in the Bible, in chapter 23, you don't have to go there, but in chapter 23, you see actually the first mention of somebody's burial and preparing for a burial like this, and it's actually Abraham's wife, Sarah. And if you remember the story, he pays for a plot of land, and the guy's going to give it to him. And he's like, "No, I want to pay for it." And he has that there in Canaan land. And then the patriarchs from that point forward are all buried in that sepulcher, in that place that Abraham bought this and buried his wife. He's buried in that same place, we see. Okay, so in verse 9 and 10 of our text, we see that. It says, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth. There was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. So anyway, you see in the Bible already, early on, there's this understanding that there was a preparation made of a burial. So first point I want to make is just this: having a proper burial is biblical. And so again, I get a fair amount of questions about that. And I myself often will say, hey, I don't care. Obviously, whenever this body is dead, it was just a shell and it's just sitting there. And I don't know about you, but I'm not real big on looking at open caskets and looking at the person that's embalmed and they got makeup on them and stuff like that. And I just don't even want to see them, because it's like, that's not them. You know what I mean? They're gone. Mm-hmm. The soul's not in there anymore. And so I often have that kind of attitude that's just like, hey, just throw me in a box, or I don't care. And a lot of people nowadays, because of how expensive it is, for one thing, they'll be desperate, and they'll go to the funeral home and say, what do we do? And they'll say, hey, here's the cheapest option, cremation. And so they'll elect to have their loved one cremated. And this is a question I get a whole lot. What do you think about cremation? Now, I didn't know the history behind this, but apparently, as so much of our religious views and practices and hang-ups, you can go back and follow the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church at some point was teaching that, if I understand right, if you cremated your loved one, then you wouldn't go. They wouldn't go to heaven. Okay, there was this kind of understanding, and they redid that. Like, the Catholic Church doesn't teach that anymore, but way back there was some sort of a teaching along those lines, which is really strange, because again, we understand that this body is going to perish. It's going to be corrupted. I mean, how many years can flesh and these cells without life? How long can they last? Obviously not very long. They decompose and all that. Sorry for the morbid Sunday morning, but. And so, who cares about the body? I'm like, burn it. What about someone that was burned at the stake? Are they not going to go to heaven because their body was burned? That's weird, okay? And we understand that God's going to raise us up an incorruptible body, going to get a glorified body in heaven. It has nothing to do with this flesh. Okay, so it doesn't matter what you put in the casket. Your loved one's not going to have that in heaven. I remember the saying, I used to always hear people preach this, where they would say, I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul trailer. Have you ever heard that? Like, you can't take it with you when you go. I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul trailer. Well, lo and behold, somebody in the internet age, spotted a hearse that was pulling a U-Haul trailer and posted it online and ruined that illustration for everybody. But yeah, I mean, it's true that you can't take anything with you, even this flesh. It's gonna be corrupt. So So in reality, what do I think about cremation? I might talk about that here more in a minute. Well, let's just jump right on it, okay? Go to 1 Samuel 31. And if you're going to search the Bible for a place that talks about cremation, I don't think you're going to find it. You have to really stretch to make it fit. But 1 Samuel 31 is kind of like the closest you come to it. First Samuel 31. Look at verse 11. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tree of Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Okay, so, these men had been, they'd been treated, pretty badly. And there's actually a separate crime for that. If somebody murders somebody, that's one thing, but there's a separate crime that they'll attach to that if they do something to that. Sorry for the morbid nature. I really don't even like talking about it. But if they do something to the corpse afterwards, like that's kind of improper, it's not respecting to it, then that's a whole separate crime, even today in our laws. And so we see that even in the Bible days, there was this idea of, this respect that was paid to a person that died. And it was a terrible thing to die and not have an honorable burial. And so in this case, they took because of the conditions of the body, what was left of it, they burned it, and then they had the bones, and they went ahead and buried the bones. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep apologizing for this, but I don't like really talking about this subject. But one of the things about cremation is a pretty new. It's kind of a new thing in modern generation because of the fact that it is hard to get a fire that's so hot that it'll completely cremate the remains of a body. And so you can see how throughout history, like even if somebody was burned, their bones and their teeth and stuff like that would still be remained. And so they would have to bury that. And so, is there any picture of a cremation in the Bible that would be like a cremation that we would have today? No, I don't think that was even a thing back then. However, can somebody be burned and they die and they still go to heaven? I don't even think I need to talk about that. Like obviously that has no bearing on whether somebody goes to heaven. And so if somebody were to cremate their loved one and still, bring respect to them, bring honor to them, in my opinion, they're not doing anything wrong. If they, I personally wouldn't cremate anyone in my family, and I would rather not be cremated. But it has nothing to do with one way is better than another necessarily, but it just seems more proper and biblical to do it this way. And there's several reasons I can go for that. For one thing, a Christian burial seems to picture throughout the Bible, it seems to picture Christ's burial and his resurrection. Okay. And so, even the Bible makes reference to that, like Romans 6 and other places. It talks about how they're buried into the ground, just like a seed is planted into the ground, and then it's raised up, a new life. And just like that seed that's buried into the ground is then raised up. And so, it uses baptism as a picture. It goes into the water, not sprinkled or whatever, but it goes into the water and then comes up a new life, and that's the picture that we're using. So it's a picture of burial. Let me read Romans 6:4. It says, "Therefore we are buried with him in baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." And in Colossians 2:12 says, "Buried with him in baptism, wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead." And so, just the picture of, a proper burial to me makes better sense to just bury them as opposed to, the picture of burning the bones completely. And you can see where somebody would say like, hey, that's like a picture of hell. it's not like, you know what I mean? No one's thinking of that whenever they cremate their body, but I can see the comfort that somebody would have and say, I'm not going to do that. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's just my thoughts on that, but it's a crazy thing to preach on a Sunday morning, but here we are anyway. Okay, so in the Bible, again, we're talking about the fact that the biblical, there's a proper burial that is talked about in the Bible. There are many mentions of people burying their loved ones. We already talked about Abraham in Genesis 23. He buys a burial place for Sarah. In this text here in chapter 25, Abraham himself is buried. Look at Genesis 45. No, Genesis 47. We see that Israel or Jacob, before he dies, he tells Joseph not to bury him in Egypt, but to bury him in Canaan. And so they actually have to like carry his bones around until they get there, so that they can bury him there. So Genesis 47. Sorry. Genesis 47, verse 29. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. That's how they made a deal. And deal kindly with, or I guess a pledge, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burying place. And he said, I will do also as thou sayest. And he said, Swear unto me. And he sware unto him, and Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. Now again, nothing is saying, there's nothing in the law. You can read through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I don't think you're going to find anywhere that it says you have to bury somebody in such and such manner. But there's this concept throughout the Bible that they're wanting to honor and to pay some respect to the loved one. So as you keep going on, let's see here. There's just tons of places that talk about this kind of process of burying somebody. When we get to, let's just go ahead and go to John chapter 11. When we get to the story of Lazarus, we see another element here. So John chapter 11, New Testament now, many, many years later, time of Jesus. And of course, this is where Jesus ends up raising Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days. But in this time that he's buried, they don't know that he's going to raise him up. And they just assume, hey, he's dead now, and what are we going to do? Obviously sorrowing and all that kind of stuff. So look at verse 17. John 11, verse 17. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary, that's Lazarus' sisters, to comfort them concerning their brother. Okay, so what I want you to notice there, obviously they're burying him and they're going through this procedure, and you see that many of these Jews came out so that they can comfort the family. And so one of the things about having a funeral service or some kind of burial, graveside, whatever, is that you want to go out to show comfort, to give comfort to those loved ones who lost their loved ones. So that is a natural thing, something that we want. Now it's interesting. Like I have heard a lot of people that have said, when I die, like you're not even going to know about it. I just got already set up to where they're just going to put me in the grave and nobody's even going to know about it. Well, that's actually not really fair to the family that might want to grieve, and they might want to have other people come to be part of that. I didn't even realize whenever I was studying this that you literally just got back from a funeral, flying out to a funeral. I didn't even think about that. So it's natural that we would want to go even sometimes to great lengths to go be there for the person that's having a funeral service. And again, in my life, it's kind of like, I don't want to be disrespectful, but that's just kind of how my mind works. It's like they're dead now, let the dead bury the dead. That's a biblical quote, and I just move on with my life and go do things and press on. But, there are times, opportunities where we can say, hey, you know what, maybe I can drop in. There's more to that quote, let the dead bury the dead, that I don't have time to deal with. But maybe I can go be a blessing and help, just temporary, just quickly, be of some comfort. And it might even take, getting a day off work and going out to that place and being there to show respect to them. It's right, and it's actually, we see it in the Bible, it's biblical. So they had a burial there in John 11, and then they also had a big gathering of people who came out to comfort the family. Okay, so the first thing is just, first point I just simply want to show you that all throughout the Bible we see this concept of having a proper burial. So it's a biblical concept. Whether or not, what the purposes serve, that's not the important thing, but we do see that it's a biblical thing. But number two, having a proper burial honors our loved ones. Okay, and so I've already kind of hit on that a little bit, but we tend to want there to be a good turnout of people who come to a funeral, because what we think about our loved one that we're burying is, hey, this is a great demonstration, a great sign, a great testimony that all these people love them. You know what I mean? And so I've already mentioned how I've preached several funerals. And one of the first funerals that I preached, the dad of a kid that was coming on our bus route to our church, his dad passed away. And it was one of those guys that, he wouldn't really step foot in church, didn't want anything to do with the Lord, and it was an unfortunate situation. I do think that his mom is saved. I don't know about the dad, but here's what I know. The funeral, they did come out. A lot of people came. They did show respect to the memory. But here's the thing, and this is what's going to separate. If I'm looking at everybody, I think everybody in this, in this congregation is saved. And so the way we look at death and the way we look at funerals is going to be quite a bit different than the world. Now, if you've ever been to a funeral, how many of you have been to a funeral of people that were just not saved whatsoever, as far as you could tell? At least the majority of people there, it just had no Christian testimony, didn't go to church, anything like that. Is anyone like that? Or most of you had, if you've been to funerals, they had some kind of religious background. Well, let me tell you, this one, was very unique. It's very, the first thing is, I was asked, because, they asked me if I would conduct this service, and they said, hey, so-and-so really liked superheroes. He and his son really liked superheroes. So we're asking that everybody comes to the funeral wears a superhero t-shirt. And I was like, well, this is kind of, okay, no big deal. Like I want to do it for you guys. I want to be there for you guys. And so I tried to get creative, and I wore a Superman shirt. I went out and bought a Superman shirt. And then I just wore a white shirt that I had unbuttoned so you could kind of see the Superman shirt, and then a jacket over it, so that just my preference is I wanted to kind of look, conservative and dressed up nice. And so I went there. And so here's the thing, and this will happen if you go to these funerals of people who aren't saved. One after another, people will want to get up there and they'll want to talk. Or if it's really bad, and I've been to some of these as well, they want to get up there and do a talent show. And they want to get up there and sing a song and have this big talent show. Or I went to this one church, it was a black church. Seriously, Valerie and I were like the only white people, and we were in the ghetto. And I'm just talking about after the funeral, there were gunshots across the way, and we were driving out, and there were gunshots. And they weren't just shooting up in the air, like, no, somebody had just robbed a store over there. And so we're like, get down. We're driving. And at this funeral, I kid you not, there were like 10 different churches that represented there, because they had helped this person out, or they had been to their church or something like that. 10 different churches. And everyone had a representative that would get up there and say, hey, we love so-and-so, and they used to come to our church. And by the way, if you're ever looking for a church, our church is right down on Soda. And it was just like this advertisement for the church, and I was just like, that's weird. That's weird. And then this lady got up there, oh, amazing grace. And it just like on and on and on. It was just like this show. It was just a crazy show. And then at the end, and this happens at a lot of funerals too, there was fighting and there was contention and people were arguing and it was just like, okay, we're out of here now. At the funeral where I wore the Superman t-shirt, that one, that's one that I won't ever forget. Again, some people wanted to come up and give a testimony. And here was their testimony. Well, we were kids, we grew up together, and we sure like to get in trouble together. And I remember when we smoked our first joint, and I remember when we did this, and everything was just like praising all the wicked things that they had done in life. And hey, I would cover for him when he did something he wasn't supposed to do, and all this, and everybody's just laughing and all that stuff. And I'm like, we're here to honor this person's name, you know what I mean, and his testimony. And this is how they honor him. Well, here's the thing. First and foremost, as a Christian, everything we do should honor the Lord. And so a funeral should always honor the Lord. And the greatest, if you think about it, you live your whole life, hopefully as a Christian, you're trying to honor the Lord. So you live your whole life trying to honor the Lord. If in your death, even after you're dead, you can continue to honor the Lord, what a blessing. What a way to go out. People get saved at funerals sometimes, because most funerals of a I want to say just Baptist, but I think you could add a whole lot of other places in there, but they actually give a gospel a gospel presentation during the service. And so I've known a lot of people that have gotten saved through at a funeral service. It's funny, I had one missionary one time to the Native Americans, and he, in his letters he's always talking about how hard it is to reach people and to get people saved. And he was like, in the letter he made this big deal about people don't just get saved. Like, you don't just preach the gospel to people and they get saved. You got to build a relationship with them for a long time and all that stuff. So he's like, we never go and just hit somebody up and start preaching the gospel to them. We want to build a relationship and all that. And in the same letter he said, oh, but praise the Lord, I preached a funeral for somebody, and I gave the gospel testimony, and a couple days later somebody walked up to me and said, hey, I was at that funeral and you preached the gospel, and I went home and I got saved. And I'm like, he just said, I got up and preached a funeral service, I preached the gospel, and somebody got saved. But then he said, well, you can't just go preach the gospel to somebody and expect them to get saved. And I'm like, you just contradicted yourself in your own letter. Okay, so always preach the gospel. Build a relationship. I'm fine with that. If you preach the gospel and the person doesn't get saved, don't give up. Just build this relationship, and I'm fine with that. But there's no reason not to give the gospel, right? That's the power of God unto salvation. So anyway, funeral service should always honor God, but while you're honoring God, you're trying the best that you can to honor the person that's in there as well. And so, man, I'm telling you, it's night and day when you go to a funeral, because I've been to other funerals where somebody had lived for the Lord. Maybe it was even somebody who was in the ministry full time, or they just had a whole life that honored God. And man, it's like night and day. One funeral, everybody's just talking about themselves, and they're fighting, and they're not too concerned about that person. They're just concerned about themselves. And in another one, you're almost wondering like why there isn't more tears, because funerals are supposed to be sad, and yet they're rejoicing because they know that their loved one's in heaven, and they're honoring that person's memory, and they're laughing about things in the past, and they're preaching the gospel to anybody that might be there that's not saved, and all these things, honoring the Lord and also honoring that person that was there. That's what I want to happen. If Lord willing, you guys have to bury me one day. Somebody has to bury me. I want it to be something that honors God. And you know what? Just hide all those faults of mine. Hide all those sins and talk about the good things I did for the Lord. I want my memory to be honored in that way. So anyway, I heard a story of I got to be careful, and this is online. I don't have that many listeners. But sometimes, I tell a story, and I'm like, if a certain person hears that, they might not like it. I heard of a guy that had cancer for a long time, and they knew he was going to die. They didn't know exactly when, but the time was coming where he was going to die. And so they decided to have a funeral before he died. And so it's like, hey, why not just honor you and praise your life and praise your memory before you die? And I was like, that's kind of weird, because like you're just sitting there like, oh, give me praise. No, you can wait till I'm dead, and then you can honor me and praise me. But, I'm just kidding. But that's what funerals are for. Have you ever been to a funeral? Maybe you have, I don't know, but where they got up and said, that guy was just the scum of the earth, And you go to a place that it's not even Christian, and they're like, well, if there is a hell, we know where so-and-so is. You know what I mean? Because everybody goes there and like, well, they're in a better place. They're atheists. You know what I mean? They're in a better place right now. They're not suffering anymore. Rest in peace, or whatever they say to give their stuff. but they want to honor that person, and that's right. And so we see this all throughout the Bible, and it's just something that I feel like we could deal with today. Okay, so in the Bible, anyone who dies without a proper burial is pitied. It's like a sign, it's a terrible thing that they didn't get a proper burial. And so in one place, in fact, I taught a Sunday school lesson a while back. You think this is an odd subject. The entire subject was on dung in the Bible. Okay? Yeah, I know, I picked some good ones. And it was interesting that a good portion of the times that dung is mentioned in the Bible, it says that this person died and they were as dung upon the earth. And it's like, what does that mean? They were as dung upon the earth. What it means is they were like Jezebel, for example. She died, and most people in any kind of a leadership royalty or whatever, and she was queen royal, right? So they should have had a good, proper burial, and they honored her name. No, she died in the field. Dogs came, took care of her, and he says that she died as dung, or she was as dung upon the face of the earth, meaning just no better than just, compost, just sitting there for the ground. And it was like thought of as a great sign of dishonor that they didn't get that proper burial. Look at Deuteronomy 21. Deuteronomy 21. So I said that there's no place in the Bible that tells you how to bury somebody. There's examples, but there's nothing that specifically says like this is a law. Well, there was this law that was given to somebody who was punished by death. And so if, you watch an old Western movie or something like that, they would hang somebody, and then they would just leave them there. You come into town, and there's just people, you don't know how many days they've been hanging up in the tree or whatever. According to the Bible, that would be wrong. That would be against God's laws. Okay, look at Deuteronomy 21, verse 20. Let's see, 21, 23. Let's go up to 22. And if a man hath committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain at night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that the land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So I just thought that was interesting. It was like, just don't leave him there. Yes, he was hung, an example was made out of him, all this kind of stuff. Now, take him down and bury him. And it could a little bit have to do with hygiene and stuff like that, but there's this thought that's like, just get rid of that body. Even though there's a lot of death in the Bible, and there's a lot of gore, and there's a lot of violence in the Bible, God doesn't like any of those things. He doesn't like violence, and we shouldn't love death, and we shouldn't think about gory type things. All right? But it's something that in life we naturally have to deal with. And so deal with it in respect, deal with it in honor, and that's kind of what he's showing here. And so this is why, like I said, even today, anything done disrespectfully to a body after it's dead is actually a crime, because of the fact that it's just right and it's proper that we would try to honor a person who dies. So this is why it's important for families to come together when they're paying respect to somebody and they're honoring that person who has died. They should come together, and let this be a lesson for anybody who goes to a funeral, okay? And maybe you have problems with the person, with part of the family members, or this person doesn't get along with that person. Put all that aside. You're there to comfort the family. You're there to pay your respects and honor the memory of your loved one. Forget about all the differences that you have and make it about honoring the memory of your loved one and honoring God. Okay? Look back at Genesis 21. Now again, in our text, we saw that Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their father. Now, we don't really know what their relationship was like. I would just assume there was no relationship. But the last time that Ishmael is mentioned in the Bible does give us that story. Look at Genesis 21, verse 11. or verse 12. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of the bondwoman and all that Sarah... Let's see, where do I need to start here? I don't want to read the whole thing. Let's back up to verse 6. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast that same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, that's Ishmael, talking about Ishmael, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And so then you keep going, just skip down to verse 20. It says, and God was with the lad, and he grew, and he dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer, and he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. And that's it. We don't hear about Ishmael anymore until Abraham dies, and then Ishmael comes to help Isaac bury his father. And I've just always thought that that's quite a picture of saying, hey, whatever our differences were, I know that, you apparently mocked me. I don't know what went on. I don't know what that's all about. You apparently mocked me whenever I was a kid. I know that, my mom had your mom thrown out into the streets. I mean, you think there was any strife that could have been there? For sure. Some contention that could have been there. But at this time, they said, you know what? It's not about me. It's about honoring God, because the life of Abraham was certainly a testimony towards God. And so it's honoring God, and it's honoring this person who we're burying. And so this is what we need to do whenever we are, when it comes to a time where we're burying somebody. We need to put aside all those other differences. There's nothing I hate worse than hearing about a funeral where everybody was fighting, and particularly, what often they're fighting over, like who gets what. Whenever that person dies, they're fighting over, well, I got this, and I know that there's more money that you're not telling me about, and all this stuff. And it's just like, you just lost your loved one. You're just like smearing their name right now. You're just like, you're dishonoring them in every way. Or, like I said, at the funeral, this person will see that person, and then all of a sudden the memories of the past will come back, and then there'll be some fight whenever they're there. Or they'll fight over what happens to the body, whether it should be, this should be done with it or that done. Now, look, there's some reasonable things that we need to sit down and talk these things out, and we need to figure out what that person would have liked and what the closest members of the family want. I understand that, but to come together and have fights is just completely opposite of what the purpose of a funeral is all about. But having a proper burial is a good way to put some closure to the life. And again, it's particularly nice when that person has been a believer and has a good testimony, and you can actually just enjoy that memory and talk good things about that person. But here's just 3 points of application. Okay, number one, I think we could all agree with this. You're going to die one day. We all know that. So you've heard people say, like, live your life like, somebody's going to tell the story after you're gone, something along those lines. It's very true. It's very true. You might think, well, what do I care? I'm going to be gone. Well, your family cares. You know what I mean? The Lord cares, because guess what? What you do in this life doesn't stop after you die. I was talking, I think it was Justin, I was talking with him here recently. We kind of get, in some kind of deep conversation sometimes. All of the guys do, really. But we were talking about this, and I said, I heard a preacher one time say this. He said, the reason why we don't get our rewards in heaven until Judgment Day, because I don't know if you knew that or not, but the Lord comes back bringing his rewards. Like, I don't know what happens between now and then if someone dies. I know that they're in heaven to be with the Lord, but I don't know exactly what happens until Judgment Day. But I heard somebody say, like, why they're not judged right away for their works? Because they're still gaining on this earth, even though they're in heaven, like by the things that they did. I mean, I don't know how it works, but let's say I lead somebody to the Lord, and then I die, and that person that I led to the Lord leads somebody else to the Lord. In a way, didn't I have some kind of a fruit in that? You see what I'm saying? So I don't know how that works, but all the things that we did in this life, the things that we set up, our families, investing in our kids, and then whenever we die and our kids continue to live for the Lord, it's a reflection on us. And somehow maybe we get rewards in the end for things that they did because we taught them to do it. Like, I don't know how that works, but I think that, we should live our life realizing that laying up our rewards in heaven doesn't just stop whenever we die. And the opposite is true too. For those who have done some good works, we already realize in the Bible it talks about how we can lose our rewards. Like if we're doing something to be seen of men, hey, well then you already have your reward on earth. You don't need a reward in heaven. But how many times someone did something bad, and they're just waiting, for that judgment day where those things are dealt out, and it says, hey, because, you did this and all these things happened. Man, we got a lot of stories in the Bible where, people did good things that looks like maybe they lost that reward eventually because they did a bad thing at the end that undid that after they died. I don't know how all that works out, but I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. So, number one, strive to live a life that will honor the Lord even after your death. Number two, and I think this is important, prepare for your death in order to make it easier on your family. All right, this is something that I see as a pastor. Like I said, every time someone dies, it's just like, I don't know, and there's stupid laws out there, and there's all these expenses, and you can't just go, bury grandma by a tree in the backyard like they used to do. You know what I mean? You have to do this, and you have to do that, and so it is wise, I think, as Christians to be good stewards of what God's given us, to say, like, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and start setting some money aside or whatever, make preparations so that it's all written out so that if I die, God forbid, my family won't have that extra stress of taking care of those things. And so prepare for it. You say, why are you talking about that? Because it's in the Bible. That's the only reason. I really have no other agenda to preach this message. It's in the Bible, so we're dealing with it. And I think that's an application that we can get out of it. It's good to be prepared for these things like Abraham was. And then thirdly, if a loved one dies, and it's going to happen to all of us, don't let that, like so many times I see somebody lose his faith, so to speak. They claim to be a Christian, and then their loved one dies, and they're just like, I don't believe it anymore. Why not? Because my loved one died, and I pray that they wouldn't. You do realize everybody's going to die, right? You can't keep everybody alive by prayer because everybody's got to die. It's appointed unto man wants to die. And so it's going to happen. You're going to die, or if you're around, you're going to have loved ones that are going to die. And when that happens, forget about everything else except honoring the Lord. That's all. It should always be your priority. Seek first the kingdom of God. Honoring the memory of that one who died, and comfort the family. I mean, that's literally what a burial and a funeral is all about. All right? Crazy Sunday morning message. Not a topic I would have picked, but that's why we preach through the Bible like this sometimes, right? Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this church and everyone's here today, and for their attention and sacrifices made to be here. Thank you for the efforts towards soul winning and serving you. Lord, I pray that you'll be blessed for the fruit that is born for you, and I pray you continue to work through us, Lord, that we might bear more and bring honor to your name. Help us, Lord, to live lives also that would leave a lasting testimony and have a lot of potential to even bring people to you even after our death through the testimony and through the preaching opportunities. And I just pray you use this message in whatever way you have fit. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. So Valerie's going to play. We're not going to sing, but she'll just play for a little bit, and Josiah can go ahead and get ready. I don't think we have a towel, so he's going to have to drip dry or something. Now, I'm guessing you need to change into what you want to get baptized in, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, it's under my clothes. I'll wrap it.
Okay, no problem. All right, so she's just going to play a little bit, and we'll kind of loosely be dismissed until he gets back in here and gets ready. And then it'll just be real quick. We'll baptize him and say a few things about it, and then after that, you'll be fine with us.